Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the ATBS Independent Contractor Benchmark Conference Call. We appreciate you taking time out of your morning to be on our call and share your time with us. Those of you that are ATBS customers, we appreciate your business. Thank you so much for being an ATBS customer, and look forward to sharing some information with you this morning. So our goal, for those of you that haven't been on this call before, is to just give you some really good information about the trends in the industry, how owner-operators are doing overall, how they did in 2019, what we expect to happen in 2019, and just, kind of give you a glimpse of all the data that we gather here. Really gives us some good insights into how things are going. And my guess is for most of you, you feel a bit frustrated and you're struggling a bit in your business because things are certainly not what they were in 2018, and 2019 was a more challenging year, and 2020 is shaping up to be pretty similar to 2019. So I'm going to talk through a whole bunch of data. Hopefully you're not driving down the road taking notes. We'll record this call and make it available as well. We'll be doing a Facebook Live next week with some of the data live so that you can actually see the slides if you want to, but I'll do my best to talk through numbers. I know it's not always easy to not see them and hear them, but I'll do my best to explain to you what we're talking about. So I'm going to start off just by simply saying we're in a crazy time. I've been in trucking for 30 plus years, and trucking's always crazy. It's never the same. We have our good years, we have our bad years, but this year is just starting off a little bit crazier than most, simply because we have a lot going on. If you pay attention at all to the stock market, one day it's up 1,000, the next day it's down 1,000. And when you listen to the news and what we got going on with the coronavirus, you might think the world's coming to an end. If you're driving down the road listening to cable news channels all day, you probably just want to park your truck and jump out and end it all, because it just sounds like it's going to end anyways. And really what we do here at ATBS is try and take some, numbers and data and statistics, and when you're in a time like now, you can make yourself crazy, you can worry yourself, you can be angry about what's going on and just be frustrated every day, or you can, take a realistic view of the world and figure out how to deal with it and make the most of it and do the best that you can. And, most of the folks that we deal with at ATBS as owner operators, independent contractors, they chose that route for a reason. They don't want to be victims of somebody telling them what to do and, making things bad for them. As an owner operator, you're a business person for yourself, so you can choose every single day, how to make yourself successful, even in challenging times. That's why you made the choice to own your own business. So hopefully we can give you some tips and tricks and thoughts on how to make the most out of 2020, because it's not going to be a simple year, but it's a year that you can do, all right in if you manage your business well. So with that, I'm going to kind of get started and talk about a few things. If you were on this call last year, we always like to start off the year by making predictions about, what we think is going to happen with the coming year. And we always like to hold ourselves accountable and see if what we thought was going to happen actually really happened. So I'm going to talk about 2019 in review a little bit and talk about the predictions that we made and if they came true or not. First prediction we made at the beginning of last year was that we had added significant capacity in trucking. And really what that meant was that freight and rates were going to moderate a bit overall in the industry. I liken it to in trucking, we always do this to ourselves through every boom cycle. For me, it's a little bit like going to an all-you-can-eat buffet and being really hungry. You can't help yourself but from taking everything that looks good, and we stuff ourselves and we feel miserable afterwards, and then we wonder why we ever ate so much. Trucking does the very same thing. When times are good and rates are good and things are going up, our industry just adds more and more and more trucks until we've added too many trucks and we're stuffed. And next thing you know, there's too many trucks and there's not enough freight for all those trucks, and things turn around. And on average, a typical good trucking cycle will last about 18 months. And then a typical down cycle will be 24 to 36 months. So, we saw that good cycle from really mid to the end of 2017 through most of 2018 into real early 2019, and then things got challenging. So, arguably we're well into the 12th month of a more challenging time for trucking. So, the odds are pretty good that we got another 12 months, maybe even 24 months to go through this process. The next prediction that we made is in 2018, the market was so good, really a market we've never had before. There were a lot of drivers that went out and got their own authority and became what we call lone rangers. They went out and did their own thing in the spot market, got their own trailers, their own insurance, all of that. And the market was so good they could make a lot of money. When we hit 2019 and things slow down and that spot market drops tremendously rate wise, it puts a hurt on people that went and did that, and they're not making the money they're used to. They're not taking the money home. They can't pay the bills. And so there's what we call a flight to quality, which typically means those drivers then go look for some of those longer term contracts that are in place that are still shipping freight and paying a reasonable rate. A lot of those drivers want to go back to carriers in more difficult times. The hard part is when that happens, a lot of carriers don't want to add capacity because there's not enough freight in the industry. And so even though you want to get out of the spot market and go get some longer term contract freight with some carriers, maybe those carriers don't necessarily want to sign you on. So we kind of saw that mix happening in 2019 where a lot of drivers were looking for a safe home and couldn't find one. One thing that I think is really important for us all to remember and keep in perspective is that the bar was raised significantly in 2018. It was a time like no other. So as 2018 came about, we had the ELD mandate going into effect. For better or worse, it's water under the bridge. But what that really did was wipe out a decent amount of overall capacity and ability to haul freight. And at the same time, we had a lot of economic incentives come into place. The Trump tax cuts and, a lot of things were happening. So freight took off. So those two things combined allowed us in this industry to take between 12 to 15% rate increases. Typically in a normal good time in trucking, we'll take 2 to 3, in the best of times, we'll take a 5% rate increase. So we were taking 3 times the normal rate increases in 2018 because the market allowed us to do that. Certainly we fell off some, especially in the spot market when we hit 2019. But the good news is the bar was raised so high that we will never go back below those 2018 rates again, I believe. We use a lot of that money, right? We got those rate increases, but our costs keep going up. Insurance costs are up, truck prices are up, maintenance costs are up, driver wages. If I'm a fleet owner that has company drivers, I pay my drivers more money. So rates overall went up, and we needed that to make ourselves whole in this business. But the good news is, like in the past, a lot of times we'll give up that 3 or 4% rate increase when we go through the downtimes in trucking. We're not going to give all that up. We're going to maintain some of that rate increase, which is a good thing. We also predicted the net income would go down for owner operators overall in 2019. That happened, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But we also said when we had this call last year, and if you're an ATBS client, a lot of the things that our consultants were talking to you about last year were, you don't have to suffer like the market. You don't have to just be part of the herd of sheep that suffers. If you manage your business and you do the right things, you can do okay. And really what we started preaching this time last year was 2018 was all about revenue. There was so much money in freight. Rates were so high. It was all about revenue. And so drivers are driving faster to get to the next load. They're actually taking extra time off because things were so good. They were making enough money they could get some extra time off. In 2019, it became more about costs. We had to manage the cost side of the business and focus more on fuel costs and things like that. 2020 is going to be another year like that. For sure we got to generate revenue, but we can't be as choosy and picky on the loads as we were in 2018. Sometimes we got to take a load that doesn't pay quite what we want it to make sure we get into another good head haul type lane that's paying high freight rates. We got to manage the cost side of the business. Remember, for every dollar you save in your business, 100% of that dollar falls to your bottom line. For every dollar of revenue you generate, you got to pay a percentage of your cost to generate that revenue. You got to drive miles. So you're paying for fuel, tires, maintenance, those kinds of things. So just remember, cost savings, the dollars that you save are really important, and it's a good time. This isn't just owner operators. This is every business in America right now is focusing on the cost side of their business because the revenue is not as good as it has been. The last thing we predicted was that lease purchase programs would proliferate. We kind of saw, the owner-operator model under attack during the 8 years of the Obama administration. The Teamsters unions and a lot of the unions that, are in favor of, and I'm not making political statements at all. I'm just saying there's a difference between Democrats and Republicans, and Democrats like people to be unionized and like them to be employees. And so they really did a lot of things politically and in the government to try and put a hurt on the owner operator model. And that had an effect, and a lot of lease purchase programs suffered as a result of that. As the administration changed, many of those laws were turned over. Many of the regulators went by the wayside. And so we saw owner operator programs proliferate again. And I can tell you, last year, even though the overall owner operator population went down, which we'll talk about in a minute, the number of lease purchase programs, we had many 1,500 truck carriers call us up that we never had done business with before that had just started a lease purchase program because they wanted to provide opportunity for their drivers to be owner operators and make more money. So we saw those programs grow last year. I'm going to define real briefly, and if you're on the call, you'll probably feel yourself fitting into one of these categories. At ATBS, we don't just look at owner operators as owner operators because they do different things and they have different needs and they fit in differently in the industry. So if you're a pioneer, we view you as a driver who's relatively new in the business. You probably are in a fleet lease purchase program. You probably sourced your truck for that fleet and you drive for that fleet. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's great. You're just a pioneer. Pioneer is a really good acronym because it's much like the Wild West back when people moved from the East Coast, 200 years ago to settle America. They got in their covered wagons and they moved west. They were called pioneers. There was a really high mortality rate, right? It was difficult to move west. There were the weather elements that kind of got people. There were animals and everything else that made it really difficult to go out and settle in the West. Same thing as a brand new owner operator. There's a lot that you need to learn to be successful. And, fortunately at ATBS, we're really good at helping folks make that transition from being a company driver to a pioneer. Next, we have hired guns. And so a hired gun is a person that's got some experience. They've gone out and they've actually sourced their own truck. So they put money down, or they have the title of the truck. They can do with it whatever they want, but they choose to operate with a fleet under the fleet's authority because that's the most comfortable operating environment for them. About 2/3 of the owner operators that operate in America operate either as a pioneer or a hired gun for a fleet because that's just where they find they can do the best and life's the best for them. And then we have lone rangers. Lone rangers are those drivers that own their own truck and they also operate out in the open market on their own. They've got their own authority, their own trailer, they're doing their own thing. So in 2018, that population exploded. There was a lot of drivers that drove for fleets, saw the open market, rates so high, they went out and became lone rangers. And lastly, we have trailblazers, and trailblazers are those drivers who have done this for a long time. They've been successful. They go out and buy their second, third, fifth truck, and they actually operate a small fleet. They've got drivers driving for them. So I'm going to talk about each of those, in a little bit different way. So I just want to have you understand that and kind of figure out where you fit into the model. Every year we do a population survey. It's not easy to get data on what the owner operator population is doing. So we kind of do informal surveys among our partner carriers and drivers. And we can tell you that, based on the survey that we did, we feel like the overall owner operator population shrank by about 3% in 2019. That's about 4,000 drivers. So, roughly there's about couple 100,000 owner operators in America. So we lost about 4,000 of those last year. In converse to that, in 2018, in the boom market, we gained about 10,000 owner operators. So one thing that tells me, we hear a lot of people saying last year was a terrible year, couldn't make any money. But one thing that tells me it wasn't as bad a year as a lot of people are saying is we would have lost more drivers than that. We gained 10,000 in 2018. We lost 4,000 in 2019. We would have lost, 8 or 9,000 or even 10,000 or more in 2019 if it was a really, really bad year. So, lost close to half of what we gained the year before. So we did a webinar yesterday. We also provide this information for a lot of the fleet partners that we work with, a lot of the big and even smaller motor carriers that use owner operators. We always survey those fleets to try and get a sentiment of what they're feeling in the industry and how things are going to shape up. We ask the question, do you plan to add to your independent contractor fleet this year? We track this, we've done it for a few years. So of course, in 2018, the majority of fleets said that they were going to add to their owner operator population. This year, when we asked that question just yesterday, the majority of fleets said that they were not going to add owner operators to their population. They weren't looking to grow because they didn't expect revenue, loads to be out there. There were a few that were in that, we're going to add 0 to 5% to our fleet. A little bit of an outlier is 19% of the folks that we surveyed said they're going to add 20% or more to their fleet. And really what I think that means is there's a lot of those smaller fleets that, mine had 10, 20 trucks back in 2018 and things were great. Shippers were looking for people to haul freight. So they struck up some good agreements with some shippers and, made some long-term agreements. And so they're still growing their fleets. So some of those smaller fleets are still looking to grow and add drivers to their fleet this year. So I'm going to start off and paint the big picture for you a little bit and talk about where we are overall economically. And, I start off making a little bit of joke about the stock market up and down, 1,000 points here and there. And, when you listen to the news, it's really hard to get a good gauge of what's actually happening economically today. One of the things that we pay attention to religiously here, because we can get data every single week on it, is the load boards, whether it's DAT or truckstop.com. You can get really good information if you subscribe to those load boards and pay attention to the data they provide. So the truckstop.com provides what they call every Monday a market demand index. And the market demand index is a simple ratio of the number of loads posted to the internet. So every shipper that's posting a load out there through truckstop.com is the top number, and the bottom number is the number of trucks. So folks like you out there looking for loads. And we, over a period of many years, the last 12 years, came to believe that a ratio of 12 to 1, if there's 12 loads posted for every one truck looking for a load, that means we're at about a break even. Things are okay for truckers. They're not good or bad. If we're above that line, if we're at a 20 ratio, things are better for truckers than they are for the shippers. If we're below that line, we're in a recession. Things are bad for truckers. So I can tell you, when we hit the boom times of 2018, that ratio shot all the way up to a 70 to 1. There were 70 loads posted for every one truck looking for a load. That's why rates skyrocketed. There was way too many freight, not enough trucks. As we came to the end of 2018 and got into 2019, that ratio fell back down into the mid 30s, which still seemed like a real good ratio. If you remember me saying 12 is the break even. And for a while, we watched it and said, we're hearing from our clients, we're hearing from fleets, things aren't very good. Things are really slow. And so 30 felt like it was a wrong number. But at the end of the day, things change, right? And something changed with the ratio and the loads being posted. And so we really came to believe that about 30 is the new break even, because that's really about where it was through most of last year. The good news is, as you follow this trend, as we've started this year, that ratio as of this last Monday was 41, and it's been trending up every week of this year so far. When you have an uptrend, that's a good thing in a ratio like that. What that really means is things are looking up a little bit, and I think much more than we expected to the start of 2020. We had kind of a rough end to 2019. The fourth quarter was definitely tough for truckers. Earnings were down, rates were down, all kinds of things. And a piece of it, I believe, is in December, we had 2 middle of the week holidays, 2 Wednesday, Christmas and New Year's. And really what that means a lot of times, and it did last year, is industry just shuts down. A lot of shippers shut down for those 2 weeks. A lot of carriers even closed down their, orientation departments. And so commerce really just kind of stops. And so when we started the year, we kind of had to make up for that. People were getting freight off their docks. And so January maybe felt a little stronger than it should have, making up for that. And then February just kind of, kept on in an even manner. Just to give you a brief idea of the spot market. So back prior to the boom time, spot rates in the dry van business were about $1.72 per mile. During the really good times of 2018 at the peak, they went up to $2.55 a mile. Today we're hovering in like the $1.85 per mile. So, we've fallen a long ways from the peak, but kind of, as I said, we haven't fallen all the way back down to where we were back prior to the boom time of 2018. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our specific operating trends. And just so you understand where our data comes from, we do business with about 20,000 independent contractors. The good news is everybody that drives a truck at the end of the day financially does something similar. They generate revenue and they have similar expenses, fuel costs, maintenance costs, truck depreciation, all those kinds of things. And so at the end of the day, we can look at that data, whether you're a port driver, whether you haul gravel, whether you're in the oil fields, dry, reefer, flat, independent, drive for a fleet. We can take all that data and we can make it look similar so that we can track trends. So I'm going to talk about some kind of big picture overall trends, and I'm going to also give you some specific data for segments of the industry that you might be operating in. So when we look at the big picture over time, miles are important, right? That's how we make money. Typically, we get paid for driving miles. The average owner operator over the last 15 years has gone from driving 139,000 miles to 100,000 miles. That's a significant reduction, about a 28% reduction. We continued to see that trend last year. 100,000 miles last year is the lowest we've ever seen for owner operators to drive. What we typically see, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but you guys for sure feel this, when times are good and rates are high, drivers actually drive less miles. For me, that's counterintuitive because I can tell you in 2018, I traveled more than I ever had before because the industry's booming and there's more owner operators than there ever has been. I can get more business, so I work harder. What happens with drivers is when rates are higher, they make a better paycheck by running less miles because freight rates are higher And, to be honest, you want your time off and you deserve your time off. So you actually take a little bit more time off when you went home over the weekend. You might not leave until, Monday instead of leaving Sunday and those kinds of things. So miles were down overall last year. But what we see is drivers start driving more when things slow down and rates come down because they have a paycheck they got to earn, right? They got to cover the home bills. We didn't really see that last year in the first half of the year. Overall miles were down last year, but come June, July, when things really, we kind of started to feel the pain and rates coming down, drivers actually started driving more. So they actually drove about 500 miles more year over year in the back half of 2019 versus 2018. That's one of the trends we expect to see as we go through this year. Our guess is drivers are going to have to drive a bit more this year to keep the same amount of money simply because rates are going to be down a little bit. Just to give you a little bit of data, because we break it out between independent dry reefer and flatbed. Flatbed guys always run lower miles on average. Last year, they ran about 85,000 miles. Independents are pretty close. They usually run higher revenue per mile, so they ran about 90,000 miles. Reefer drivers, they always run the most. They typically have still long length of hauls, oftentimes cross country. They ran about 115,000 miles, and the average dry van driver ran about 105,000 miles. So again, just trying to give you some data so you can take your specific operation and kind of see how you stack up. I'm going to talk for a minute about the Cass Freight Index. And so, at ATBS, we have our own proprietary data that we get from all of your profit and loss information. But we also like to benchmark that against things going on in the industry like DAT, like truckstop.com. The Cass Freight Index is something that's really neat to look at because it's a freight pay company that pays about $30 billion worth of freight bills per year. So by far the biggest and a huge amount of data. So if you looked at the Cass Freight Index, what you would see is 2018 was, of course, a boom year. Things were better than, there was more shipments than there ever had been in trucking before. If we look at 2018, we're about 10% below that for most of the year. The trouble is when we hit the fourth quarter, we dropped significantly down. By the time we hit December of 2019, we were below, as far as number of shipments, we were below 2018, 2017, and even 2016. So the year ended up really, really tough. The good news about that, even though freight struggled, is kind of like I talked about. If we look at the Cass Freight Index and look at the dollars spent for those shipments, the revenue remained really high. It tracked almost even with 2018 revenue. So what that tells us is, the rate per mile still remained fairly decent through most of last year. A lot of those, and understand this is not spot market freight. This is long-term contracted freights where you got big carriers that have 3-year commitments from shippers. That's what's getting paid through Cass Freight Index. And so a lot of those contracts held up through last year, even though shippers started renegotiating. The revenue held up fairly well, which is good news. So if I translate that to our numbers, we saw the average owner operator exactly the same in 2019 as they were in 2018 for revenue per mile. They made $1.54 per mile. And again, I'll give you the different segments. In the flatbed, they made $1.86 per mile on average. Reefer made $1.42 per mile on average. Dry van made $1.47 on average. And the independents out there did $1.70. So, you run more miles, you make less per mile in the reefer. In the dry van segment. In the flatbed, you run less miles, but you make more per mile. At the end of the day, the revenue is pretty close in all those segments, which we'll talk about. I'll give you some ranges. We benchmark about 90 different partner carriers that we work with. And so when we look at the ranges of what drivers are making at all those carriers, on the low end, people are making $1.30 in the dry van business, all the way up to $2.30 a mile. In the reefer business, pretty similar. They're making $1.30 up to about $2.10 a mile. In the flatbed business, the bottom end is about $1.45. The top end is, over $2 a mile. If I get in the specialized business, and so that's tank haulers, that's people doing, heavy haul loads, a lot of that kind of stuff. The low end for them is $1.50. The high end can be as high as, $2.50 to even $3 per mile. So another question that we asked the fleets that we had on the webinar yesterday is, do you plan to give rate increases to the owner operators that drive for you this year? I'll start off by saying about half the fleets we work with work on percentage pay. They pay the driver's percentage. That's a good way to go for a lot of drivers that manage their business, because when rates are booming and things are going up, you participate in those rates real time as they're going up. The bad news is when rates come down as they have in the last 14 months, you participate in the downside too. About half the fleets that we partner with pay percentage pay. Those that pay per mile pay, I can tell you when we asked yesterday, there's not a fleet out there that expected to give a pay increase this year, simply because they're not getting rate increases out of their shippers that they're working with. Most shippers are trying to negotiate rates down. So don't expect a lot of rate increases this year. One slide that I'm going to talk about data on, which is going to be difficult to do over the phone as opposed to looking at the slide. It really helps us understand the market, the spot market, if I'm going to go out there and run my own business in the spot market versus leased onto a fleet. So we come up with a break-even number to tell us if I can make more money in the open market or if I can make more money leased to a fleet. That break-even number for years has been around 43 cents a mile. We raised that break even last year to 48 cents a mile. The reason that we did that is because if I'm going to run my own business, I have to buy my own insurance, and insurance costs have gone up tremendously. It used to be able to get my own auto liability insurance. I think you got to have a minimum of $750,000. I used to be able to buy that for about $4,500. Today, it's going to cost me at least 15 grand to do that. It might cost me as much as $20,000. So let me go back to that break even and describe what that is for you. If I'm going to leave a fleet and I've got my own truck and I'm going to go run my own business in the open market, I got to do a bunch of stuff. I got to get my own authority. I got to get my own trailer. I got to book my own loads. I got to do my own license and permitting, pay my own fuel tax, right? So there's some pain in doing that. We figure that's around $50,000 or right around 48 to 50 cents a mile. What I would say is back in 2018, we were way above that break even. We were close to 75 or 80 cents a mile higher in the spot market, which is why it made sense for me to go out in a lot of cases and go do that. Today, we're in the 35 to 40 cent range for that break even. So let me put that in real dollars for you. If I'm running for a fleet today, I'm going to do about $150,000 a year in revenue based on what fleets are paying. If I'm going to go out and run the spot market, I'm going to do about $185,000 in revenue. The trouble is it's going to cost me about $50,000 to go out and generate $35,000 more in revenue. So there's a net negative there of about $15,000. So ultimately what that means is it's not a winning proposition for somebody to go out there and do this on their own. There's plenty of folks out there making money and doing just fine in that open market today. But there's also drivers that left that open market, right? Because times got difficult. There's drivers that are older that have paid off trucks and they say, I'm not going to run for these rates. I'm just going to park my truck till things get better. There's also drivers that, leverage themselves, bought trailers and borrowed money from a bank that aren't doing well enough, and banks are repossessing equipment today. So, that spot market fluctuates based on what's going on. Today, it just doesn't pay for me to go out and do it on my own, unless I've really, if I'm a driver that has got a good head haul freight and I've got a shipper paying me a decent contract rate and I just have to use the spot market to get back into that lane, then I can afford those cheaper rates that are in the spot market. But to just go run the spot market every day is challenging today and to make enough money. So I'm gonna talk about gross revenue for a minute. The average owner operator did $155,000 worth of gross revenue last year. That was down about $5,500. Biggest reason it was down is just simply because we ran less miles. The average flatbed driver did about $160,000 in revenue. Average reefer driver did $162,000. Average dry and independent each did about $153,000 in revenue. I'm going to talk about fuel for a minute because fuel is really important in a lot of ways, right? It's what makes your truck go, but at the same time, it's your biggest cost typically, maybe outside of your truck, but almost always it's your biggest cost. And so managing fuel is important. The average driver last year spent 2 cents a mile less on fuel. They spent about 46 cents on fuel. Flatbedders spend more. They spend about 53 cents. Reefer guys spend more too because you have heavier loads. Flatbed guys don't have aerodynamic loads. So I'll say that fuel was down because the DOE national average, we saved about 20 cents a gallon on fuel last year versus 2018 because fuel prices came down. And so fuel surcharges were a little bit less, but we also saved money on fuel. One thing that I think is really important, if I look back to 2018, we were a little bit shocked because our average driver went down in fuel economy in 2018, and we hadn't seen that for 4 or 5 years. Trucks are more fuel efficient. Drivers are getting better at managing fuel economy. So we saw incremental gains on fuel economy for quite a few years. And then all of a sudden in 2018, it went backwards and it didn't make sense to us. As we went through the year and we, started understanding the data, what really happened is drivers kind of forgot about fuel costs in 2018. They just said, we don't really care because we're making good money and revenue is paying so much, we're going to drive the speed limit. We're not going to set our cruise at 62 miles an hour. If it's 70, we're going to drive 70 because I'm making enough per mile. I want to get to the next high paying load. At the same time, they kind of forgot about their idle costs because they're making really good money. So, I'm not going to pay attention to my idle costs. Kind of the cost side of the business went out the window. We just stopped paying attention to it. It's not a bad thing. It happens in every industry. When times are good, you focus on revenue, you forget about the costs. As we had this call last year, and as most of our consultants had conversations last year, what we said is 2019 is a different year. We need to pay attention to costs. Remember my talk at the beginning about every dollar I save goes straight to my bottom line from a cost perspective. So the good news is we saw the average miles per gallon increase. The average driver last year got about 6.6 miles per gallon, which was an increase over the prior year. If I'm in the flatbed business, I averaged about 5.82 miles per gallon. In the dry van business, I'm about 6.89. Reefers about 6.69, and independents are about 6.39. So, I know with a modern day truck, something that's a 2014 or newer, there's a lot of drivers that are getting, 7-8 miles per gallon. There's even drivers getting 10 miles per gallon. What I'd tell you is today is not a day to race to the next load and drive as fast as you can. Maybe it is if it's Friday afternoon like it will be today and I want to get loaded over the weekend. Maybe I need to drive a little bit faster to make sure that can happen and I don't get laid over the weekend. But, use every single day to make a conscious decision. Do I really need to drive fast today, or can I set my cruise on 60 miles an hour? I'm not going to spend a bunch of time going through the numbers, but it intuitively, the difference between 1 mile per gallon, which oftentimes is the difference between driving 70 and driving 60, is $10,000 a year for the average owner operator. And we can argue all day long about driving fast versus slow and driving habits and those kinds of things. You're an owner operator for a reason. You'll make your own decision. I can just tell you, dealing with tens of thousands of drivers over 20 years, it never fails. If I slow down, I manage my idle time, I can save $5,000 to $10,000 a year on my fuel costs. In a time when freight's not abundant, this is a year that it makes sense to do that kind of thing. The good news is over a period of time, the last 15 years, our owner operators continue to make incremental gains on fuel economy. We've gone from an average of 5.5 miles per gallon to 6.5 miles per gallon, so that's good. The average truck payment for our average client today, and we got drivers that have brand new trucks, we got drivers that have paid off trucks with 2 million miles and everything in between, but our average driver is paying about $2,400 a month for a truck right now. That cost continues to go up every single year. The OEMs, as they have to meet EPA standards, becomes more and more difficult. They got to do research and development, so the average cost of trucks continues to go up, and it will always, go up probably as long as we're alive. Maintenance costs. The good news seemingly is that maintenance costs went down last year. The average owner operator spent about $10,500 on maintenance. It was down $500. I say it's seemingly good news because it looks like it was down, but what we typically see when things get a little bit more difficult is drivers oftentimes will extend maintenance. They'll extend their PM. They'll put off things that don't have to be done, that put them out of service from a DOT perspective. The trouble is someday I got to pay for that maintenance. And so we typically see a spike in maintenance costs when things get good again, because drivers have to catch up with that maintenance that they put off. So it's probably just temporary. We all know that these trucks aren't getting any cheaper to maintain out there. So, what's most important to everybody out there is net income. How much money am I taking home? The bad news is it went down last year. We were really happy in 2018. The average owner operator gained $5,000 on the net income line. They went from making in 2017 $60,000 net to making $65,000 in 2018, which was fantastic to see their net income go up. Last year, the bad news is the average owner operator went down by about $2,300. So we went down to about $63,000 for the average net income. Again, I'm here to tell you that every one of you as an individual, you're in business for yourself. Your net income does not have to go down, even though things are more difficult this year. What's most important that you recognize there's change and you have to adjust your business to be successful. So the first half of the year wasn't that difficult. The net income was off about $600 January through June through the prior year. The second half of the year was when it got harder. The net income was off about $1,700 for the second half of the year. The average independent driver ran 63,000 miles, or I'm sorry, generated $63,000 in net income last year. The average dry van driver was the same, $63,000. The average reefer driver was $57,000. and the average flatbed driver was 68,000. So the flatbedders made the most money, but I can also tell you that was down $9,000. So if you just think about those business cycles, and when things are difficult, sometimes drivers think about changing things. I can tell you the flatbed business swings wilder than any of the other segments. When things are good, they make more money than just about anybody else. But when things are tougher, they struggle more and oftentimes go out of business. The reefer business is probably the most steady. It doesn't swing wildly up or wildly down. People still need to eat and drink and buy the things that come on refrigerated trailers, no matter what the economy does. The dry van's kind of somewhere in between those two. So what I feel like is in a time like now, it's not a time probably to change segments of the industry, even though I might be struggling a little bit, because that cost to change usually costs me a significant amount of money. I got to learn a new segment of the industry. I got to change fleets, or I got to get a different trailer. So typically we recommend that people stick with what they're at unless they're really, really struggling right now. So I can tell you just, some big numbers. I just gave you averages. On average, on the low end in the dry van business, we'll have drivers that will make $45,000 a year. On the high end, there's people making $90,000 per year. Remember, the average is right around 63 grand. So, you'll be somewhere in that spectrum. You can certainly be on the higher end if you pay attention and manage a business. The reefer business is about the same as the dry van from the spread. Flatbed on the low end will have people making 50 grand. On the high end, they're making close to 100 grand. In the specialized, segments of the industry, on the low end, they're making 50 to 60,000. On the high end, they can make six figures. They're still making $100,000 a year plus. The good news is, as we look over time, the average owner operator has increased their earnings. So 15 years ago, the average owner operator was making about 35 cents a mile or about $4,000 a month. Today, they're making, 65 to 70 cents a mile and about 5,500 a month. So, what that goes to tell me is we have our ups and our downs. We're in a crazy time right now. We can't lose perspective. We need to know that over time, this is a good job that, incrementally gains in good times, and, over bad times, things get better. So the good news is for the owner operator model, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with AB5 and all the attacks we had, in California last year on the owner operator model. What I really believe, and I guess one thing I should say is, we appreciate everybody that registered. We had over 100 people submit questions, so there's no way I can answer everybody's question on the call today, but I'm doing my best as we talk through the data to answer a lot of the questions that you had. But of course, some of the questions are about the owner-operator model. Will it survive? Will the government attack, or the economics of it make it go away? What I can tell you is when you think back 15 years ago and the average owner operator was running 139,000 miles to make about $45,000 a year, those were tough times. I worked really, really hard. I was away from home 5 weeks at a time. It was a tough job to make 45 grand a year. Today I'm driving 100,000 miles and I'm making $63,000 a year. So the economics continue to improve. I'm not here to say you got a great job and you make more money than anybody else. Trucking is a very hard job. What you folks do out there is the toughest job I know of. You're driving at least 11 hours a day. You're doing maintenance on your truck. You're taking care of your business. It's a hard job. But the good news is our industry recognizes that, and over time, we continue to try and increase rates, and we continue to try and elevate the earnings, because we have to, right? There's a lot of things you can do in America today besides drive a truck and go make $50,000 or $60,000 a year. So we have to continue to get the rates up in this business for you all to want to do the job. I believe that's going to happen. We're just in a bit of a lull and a dip right now. So I'll tie out with one of the last questions we asked the folks on the call yesterday, the fleets. We said, given the current political and economic environment, are you optimistic on the independent contractor model? We really saw the optimism waning, as I talked about a little bit near the end of the Obama years. And then as we transitioned into the Trump administration and changed a lot of the government regulations and rules, people became much more optimistic. The majority of people were super optimistic on the owner-operator model. I can tell you today, the answer is about 15% of the folks are, either not optimistic at all or not very optimistic. About 85% are still really optimistic on the owner-operator model. Those that are not, we're really concerned about things like AB5 and that spreading to states like New Jersey and the owner-operator attack, spreading throughout the country. The good news is I've been traveling a lot. The last 4 weeks, I've been at probably 12 different motor carriers, and I was at a big trucking industry meeting the last few days of this week. And so you get to hear a lot of what's going on. the feeling is that AB5, the attack in California that essentially outlawed owner operators, that was put on a temporary restraining order, literally on the last day at the last hour, December 31st. And the feeling is that trucking is going to win that argument. The California Trucking Association has already spent $1 million fighting that battle through the court system. They expect to spend another $2 to $3 million, but ultimately they believe they'll be victorious. Trucking has some really good, there's a law called the F-Quad-A law that preempts federally, does not allow states to individually regulate interstate commerce, which is what you all do, driving state to state. So ultimately, we believe trucking will win that battle. And really deep down in my heart, what I know is an independent contractor, you're the epitome of the American dream, right? You went out there, you took risk, you got your own truck, you run your own business. And that's why people live in America, is because we want to be able to do that. And we want to go out there and work as hard as we can and make our own money. To outlaw the American dream and say you have to work for some big company and be beholden to whatever they tell you to do and be unionized and all those kinds of things, that's just really not what our country is about. So I really believe no matter how hard the government tries to push that agenda, at the end of the day, we won't stand for it as Americans. This law really started around the Uber and the Lyft platform because, there's people out there that feel like, and certainly in some cases it may be true. There's certainly owner operators that got into a lease purchase program that wasn't a great program and they got kind of screwed over. Maybe there's Uber and Lyft drivers that are not in a good situation too, but I can tell you, I ride Uber and Lyft on a regular basis almost every single week. And I usually ask this question to my driver, and 99 times out of 100, that driver that is independent wants to be independent for a reason. They got a day job. They want to make a little extra money driving Uber and Lyft. So again, in my mind, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit on a soapbox. You cannot outlaw the American dream and what people really want to do, no matter how hard you try. So I think hopefully that's water under the bridge. We'll have to continue to fight the battle, but hopefully it's, a little bit in the rearview mirror. So I'm going to give you a few predictions. What do we think is going to happen in 2020? I'll tell you this year, 2018 was a really easy year to see what was coming. We had the ELD mandate and we had a booming economy. We knew it was going to be a good year for truckers no matter what happened. 2019 was also a pretty easy year to see. We had too much capacity added. Things were slowing down freight-wise, so knew it was going to be a difficult year. 2020, it sounds kind of really funny because 2020, right? You think I got 2020 vision, I can see really well. But what I would say is it's one of the most uncertain years I've ever seen coming into trucking. We just don't know what's going to happen. We expect it to be a lot like 2019, not a terrible year, but not a great year, just kind of a mediocre year. But we all know there's crazy stuff going on. Number one, we've got an election. That always throws, randomness into the year. What's going to happen based on who the Democratic candidate is and who gets elected. That can cause craziness in markets and shipping and consumer confidence. We have a lot of geopolitical risk, right? We've got China tariffs. We've got things going on with Iran, and who knows what that means. Let's just say something goes crazy in the Middle East and something happens. Next thing you know, oil can spike by, $30 or $40 per barrel. My diesel fuel price can go from $3 to $5 before I know it. So what I'll tell you more than anything, I haven't even mentioned the coronavirus. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute. But with all those things, what I'd say is there's a lot more downside risk today into 2020 than I've ever seen before. And so what that means is, shipping's not going to end. Trucking's not going to be over. But fuel could spike, shipping will adjust. The coronavirus has wiped out fuel on the West Coast. There's like 60% less port containers coming into the West Coast than there have been traditionally because China's not making anything, right? The country's locked down because of the coronavirus. What that means is I don't just stop trucking and park my truck. I need to adjust, right? If I can't haul freight out of LA ports that's being shipped across the country, I need to find something else to do. So I can't be as choosy. We're getting out of the snow season, thankfully, but there's a lot of drivers that don't like to chain up and run in the north in the winter. I may have to do that because things have changed, times have changed. As an owner operator, you got to understand that. One of the many questions, quite a few of you asked, where's the good freight? Where are the good rates? We live in a market and in an industry where there's so much information today that literally changes every single day. And what I can tell you is if you're out there running on your own in the spot market, even if you're running for a motor carrier, The best thing you can do at a motor carrier is listen to what they tell you. They don't lie to you. Their goals are the same as yours, to move freight, to make money. So if they tell you, I need you to go here to move a load, that's because they got loads there to move. If I'm running the spot market, DAT, Internet Truck Stop, subscribe to those services. A lot of them aren't very expensive. I can pay 35 or 40 bucks a month, but you can read data on those to see. We're coming into the summer season before long, and produce is going to start getting shipped, and that's going to completely shift the shipping lanes and what's hot and where freight rates are hot. I can't just sit here today and tell you, hey, go down to Texas because all the freight's moving out of Texas and that's where rates are great. It adjusts literally on a daily basis. And so the most important thing you can do is listen to, Road Dog Radio. They'll talk a lot about these kinds of things on there. Subscribe to some services, and get your own data to figure things out. So again, this is a year where be prepared for the downside. If fuel spikes by $2 a gallon, are you prepared for that? We've got a fuel surcharge in our industry that will help recoup that cost over time. But in the short term, the next couple of weeks, while that fuel spikes, it's going to be a cash flow hurt. So, now's the time where I need to have a few $1,000s in the bank to make it through some of those changes. If I have to adjust my business model, my freight lanes I'm hauling, all those kinds of things. We believe this is a year where drivers will stick with what they're doing. When there's a lot of uncertainty and change going on, people just kind of hunker down and do what they do. So we don't expect drivers to leave fleets, go to the spot market, or vice versa, go from the spot market to fleets. We do believe that, and we're already starting to see it, drivers are going to run more miles in 2020. It's like anybody. When things get hard, when we need to, generate more revenue, we just have to work harder. At the end of the day, we got to, run more miles, take a little bit less time off at home and those kinds of things. That's just what happens when times are tough. So we think we're going to see that happen this year. Overall, we expect net income for owner operators to remain flat to probably down a bit this year. But just remember the things we've talked about. Manage your costs, take the freight that's available. Don't say I'm not going to haul that because it's too cheap of a load. You, of course, have to make a rational decision because there is too cheap a freight out there to haul. But really, at the end of the day, what you got to understand is you're fixing your variable costs. For the sake of the time on this call, I'm not going to, go into deep details, but let's just say your average fixed costs are $200 a day. I've got to pay for my insurance on my truck every single day. I also got to pay for my home costs, my mortgage, my rent, whatever I've got at home. For an average driver, that's about $200 a day. So if I just sit today because I don't want to haul cheap freight, that $200, I still got to pay the bill. So now tomorrow, my fixed cost just added up to $400 instead of $200. I just dug myself a little bit deeper hole. So you got to really understand your fixed and your variable costs. Those are all things ATBS can help you, figure out the numbers and figure out what I really truly need to haul for. I may need to take a haul that's lower than my break even simply because I got to get into a better paying freight lane. Again, I can't do what I did in 2018 because it was easy in 2018. Anybody could, do this business and make money. I got to really understand the business and manage it today. So, that's all the numbers I'm going to talk about from an ATBS perspective. I'm just going to go through and try and address a few of the things that we heard from you when you asked questions when you signed up for this conference call. One was about taxes. Of course, ATBS is in the middle of tax season. We'll do close to 15,000 tax returns this year. We're tax experts in trucking, and people, the general questions were, how do I save money on taxes? So I'll give you a few tips. Number one, use someone that knows the business. If you're using a big box store or someone that just does taxes for, every Joe Bob out there that does anything, they don't understand trucking. There's a lot of very specific trucking tax laws that you can take advantage of. Most people know about the per diem deduction. Every day you're away from home, that's a $66 per day deduction. Company drivers, that was disallowed with the 2018 Trump tax law changes. Owner operators can still take it. So that typically winds up being a $12,000 to $16,000 deduction. Make sure you get every day you're away from home, you get that deduction. We got a new tax deduction in 2018 with the new tax law called the qualified business income deduction. If your CPA doesn't understand that, or whoever's doing your taxes, make sure you get someone who does. That's a 21% additional deduction off of your net income. So let's say I made $60,000 a year net before my taxes. I can take an additional $12,000 deduction off of my business based on that qualified business income deduction. Again, your tax preparer better know all about that. The most important thing I can tell you is when we reconcile, which we're doing right now at the end of the year, revenue versus expenses, we have a bunch of ratio analysis to see if people, fall in and kind of fit in the averages. With over 92% of the clients we do business with, we find that they're missing some sort of expense. And so really what I'm saying is keep track of your paperwork. Make sure if you lose one receipt, you spent $100 for, some supplies for your truck, and you set it on your seat, figured I'll deal with it later, get it to my accountant. And next thing you know, it blows out the window because the window's down. You just lost about a $20 bill because of that tax deduction. Make sure you gather every single business item. Even if you don't know what it is at ATBS, we say send it to us. We'll figure out if it's tax deductible. That's the most important thing you can do, is keep track of all that information. Let's see. I talked about the coronavirus for a minute. It's obviously top of everybody's mind, the news every single day. To be honest, I don't really know what to make out of it. I hear people that are scared to death of it, and I hear people say that the flu is 10 times worse. In all likelihood, we're somewhere in between. What I do know is it's got the world freaked out, and it's got industry freaked out. And so really what that means is it's going to cause havoc. It's going to cause consumers to close their pocketbooks. They're not going to spend as much money. They're not going to travel as much. They're not going to eat out as much because they're afraid to get sick. That means that we're going to ship less stuff. So in all likelihood, it means that things are going to be difficult for the next few months. Things are going to slow down. The bright news is, with all the information that I've heard from shippers, from carriers, industry meetings in the last 2 months, is everybody is expecting a good second half of this year. And I'll give you a couple of reasons for that. One is we're going to wash more carriers and more, even sadly, more owner operators out of this business in the next few months. Insurance has gone crazy. The nuclear verdicts that you read about and hear about when a truck has an accident and somebody gets an $80 million jury settlement for the lives that were lost. The lives that were lost were tragic, of course, but $80 million is a lot of money to pay in a settlement. So the insurance companies have lost their butt the last few years. They got to make that up through rate increases. And so we're seeing insurance companies increase rates by 50%, 100%. It's putting people out of business. It's putting truck lines out of business. So there will be capacity that is wiped out, which is bad. For the individuals that get wiped out. But at the end of the day, it's a little bit like the ELD mandate. As that capacity goes away, there's not enough trucks to haul the freight, which brings me to the second half of the year. What a lot of smart people are saying is the second half of the year is going to be really good freight wise, because all the stuff we're not buying that's not being shipped out of China right now because of the coronavirus, we're still going to want to buy that stuff at some point. And so a lot of those things that aren't getting made are going to pick up through the summer months and into the second half of the year. So at the same time, we're losing some capacity, freight's going to pick up. And so, really what I'm saying is keep your optimism. It's tough right now. It's going to probably get tougher with the coronavirus over the next few months. But I really believe in the back end of the year, based on what everybody's saying, that's going to make things a little bit better. There were some questions about how can I save money on fuel? And, we've talked quite a bit about fuel already. But mostly, how do I save money, me running fuel and burning fuel? We've talked about that. One thing I'll tell you is if you run for a carrier, or even if you don't, find a network, find a discount network. You should be able to save 5 cents a gallon, 10 cents. There's carriers out there that have 20 to 25 cent per gallon savings because they buy so much fuel, they negotiate savings. Or you can join a group like, NAIT, National Association of Independent Truckers. They've got good negotiated fuel rates. There are a lot of programs out there. If you run for a carrier, they can give you fuel optimization. And I know a lot of drivers feel like, carriers mark up fuel. They make money on me when I buy my fuel. Excuse me. So I'm not going to use their fuel stops. What I can tell you is if I'm with a carrier that's got a few thousand company trucks, they spend every minute of every day trying to figure out how to reduce their costs. They optimize their fuel, and they tell those drivers where to buy 50 gallons of fuel, where to buy the next 75 gallons of fuel. If they've invested millions of dollars into those systems to optimize their own fuel costs, and they're willing to allow you to share in that information, don't be distrustworthy of it. You got to validate and verify it, and make sure it's legitimate. If you can buy cheaper fuel on your own, for sure you should do that. But in a lot of cases, they're giving you a system that can help you optimize your fuel costs. So don't be afraid to try them out and use them. with that, we're not far from the top of the hour. I've given you a ton of information, so I'm going to wrap up the call. I just want to say thank you all again, those of you that are ATBS customers. If you're not an ATBS customer, I just want to thank you all in general. Truck drivers do the hardest work that I know of. You deliver the freight across America. As I tell everybody that works at ATBS, we'd be sitting here naked and hungry if it weren't for our clients, because we wouldn't have any food and we wouldn't have any clothes if you didn't deliver it for us. So thank you for all that you do. Thank you for driving safe. Thank you for keeping the American economy running. And God bless you. Drive safe. I hope you have a great day. Thanks for being part of our call.